The platform was wrapped in mist, a dense veil that muffled the usual sounds of the train station. It was Halloween night, 1935, and the midnight train to Ash Grove prepared for its departure. The steam hissed from beneath the wheels, curling up like the cold breath of a ghost, mingling with the thick fog that hung over the tracks. A handful of passengers gathered under the dim station lights, their faces pale in the yellowish glow. The station clock struck midnight with a heavy, resonant chime that echoed into the stillness of the night. One by one, the passengers boarded the train, unaware that this journey would be like no other. Henry Mathers, a businessman with a penchant for order, straightened his tie as he stepped aboard, his leather briefcase clutched tightly. He glanced back at the platform, noticing how the fog seemed thicker now, swallowing up the few passengers who remained outside. His unease grew, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. He reassured himself that he was simply tired. After all, midnight was a peculiar time to travel. Inside, the train was quiet. Too quiet. Only the soft creak of the carriages and the occasional rustle of papers from a sleepy conductor could be heard. Henry made his way to the first-class compartment, nodding to a young couple in the corridor who looked to be on their honeymoon. Their laughter sounded hollow in the empty space, but they smiled brightly enough. In his seat, Henry settled back, opening the evening paper, but the words blurred. The headline was something about a local election, but it held little interest. His thoughts drifted to his destination, Ash Grove, a small town with little significance to most, but vital to Henry's business dealings. He would arrive by dawn, secure the property he needed, and return to the city by week's end. Simple. Yet, something about the train made him uneasy. The air felt heavy, like the weight of an approaching storm. A flicker of movement caught his eye outside the window, but when he looked, only the fog moved, swirling like it had a mind of its own. As the train lurched forward, its wheels groaning against the iron tracks, a strange sensation washed over the passengers. It was subtle at first, a slight chill, a whisper of cold air seeping through the cracks of the train's aged wood. But as the train gained speed, it became harder to ignore. The old conductor, a weathered man with tired eyes, walked slowly through the aisle, checking tickets with an almost mechanical efficiency. When he reached Henry, he paused, frowning slightly. "Long night ahead," the conductor murmured, handing back Henry's ticket with a glance that lingered just a little too long. Henry nodded stiffly, not liking the way the man's eyes seemed to drift over his shoulder, staring at something behind him. He resisted the urge to look back. Across from him, the honeymooning couple whispered excitedly, pointing out into the darkness as the train passed through the thick woods. Henry could hear snatches of their conversation, ghost stories, superstitions about traveling on Halloween night. "Every year, it comes back," the woman said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say there's a ghost that rides this train, picks a new passenger to take with it, every time." Her husband chuckled nervously. "Just stories. Old wives' tales." But Henry could feel it now. That chill creeping into his bones, the air growing colder with each passing mile. He glanced out the window again, but saw only darkness and the oppressive fog. A shiver ran through him, despite himself. Suddenly the train jerked, and the lights flickered briefly. The motion startled the passengers, causing murmurs of confusion. The conductor stumbled slightly as he made his way to the back, his footsteps heavy in the uneasy silence. Henry closed his newspaper, staring out at the shadowy landscape beyond the window. For the first time in years, he regretted choosing the late train. The whistle shrieked into the night, a sound that seemed almost human, desperate, anguished. It echoed through the empty woods, and then faded into the mist. The train moved steadily through the night, its rhythmic churning a stark contrast to the unsettling silence that filled the car. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing, and inside, the air grew heavier still. The usual murmur of idle conversation had died down, leaving an oppressive quiet in its place. Every now and then, Henry thought he heard something soft, barely audible, like whispers carried on the steam curling past the windows. He rubbed his temples, blaming his fatigue for playing tricks on his mind. Yet, as he glanced around the compartment, he noticed others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The honeymoon couple, once so full of life, now sat quietly, the wife nervously twisting her wedding ring. Across from them, an older man with a large satchel kept glancing at his watch, tapping his foot anxiously against the floor. Henry shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to him. It was just a train ride, he reminded himself. A few hours through the countryside. But as the train pressed deeper into the night, the atmosphere seemed to thicken, a palpable tension hanging in the air. Then, it happened again. A whisper, low and indistinct, but clear enough to send a shiver down Henry's spine. He looked around, certain someone else must have heard it too. But no one met his eyes. The whispers grew louder, though still too soft to understand. They seemed to rise from the very walls of the train, mingling with the faint hiss of steam outside, a strange, disembodied murmur. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back of the carriage, startling everyone from their uneasy thoughts. The old woman who sat alone near the rear of the car jerked upright, her eyes wide with fear. The conductor was nowhere to be seen. "What was that?" the younger man asked, his voice tight. His wife clutched his arm, her expression mirroring his alarm. Henry stood, heart pounding, and made his way toward the source of the noise. As he moved through the narrow aisle, he caught sight of something outside the window, a fleeting shadow, dark and indistinct, moving swiftly through the fog. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The shadow disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, melting into the mist. He reached the back of the carriage, where a storage door rattled violently as if something, or someone, was trapped behind it. Henry stared at the door, hesitant to open it, but the noise had drawn the attention of the other passengers. The older man with the satchel stood up and joined him. "Could be the wind," the man offered, though his voice lacked conviction. Henry didn't respond. His hand hovered near the door's handle when the whispers returned, louder now, closer. They seemed to come from all around him, voices overlapping and intertwining in a sinister symphony. They weren't coming from the door. They were inside the train. Henry stepped back, his skin prickling with unease. He turned to the older man, who had gone pale, his eyes wide as he too seemed to hear the voices. The others watched from their seats, fear rippling through the car like a cold wave. Just then the train jerked again, harder this time, causing the lights to flicker. For a moment the compartment was plunged into darkness, and in that brief instant, Henry felt a cold presence beside him. Something watching, waiting. The lights flickered back on, but the uneasy feeling remained. Henry's heart raced as he scanned the carriage. The whispers had faded, but their presence lingered, as if the train itself had come alive with unseen, malevolent intent. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered. Henry nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to speak. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and they all knew it. But no one dared say what they were thinking. A low groan came from the train's depths, almost like a voice, and the fog outside pressed closer against the windows, as though it, too, wanted to be part of their journey. The whistle howled again, this time lower, more mournful, like a cry for help. Henry sat back down, his body tense. Whatever was happening wasn't just in his head. He glanced around at the other passengers, all of them now on edge, glancing nervously at the windows, at the doors, and at the empty aisle where the conductor had once walked. The train sped on, carrying them deeper into the night. And Henry feared, closer to something far more dangerous than mere fog. Midnight had passed, and the train now sped through the darkest stretch of countryside. Outside, the fog seemed almost alive, swirling in thick tendrils around the train, as if trying to find its way inside. The passengers were restless, shifting in their seats, stealing glances at the windows, and casting nervous looks at each other. The whispers had faded, but the unsettling presence that clung to the air remained. Henry felt a growing tension in his chest, like a taut string waiting to snap. He had given up on reading, and now he sat rigid in his seat, eyes scanning the carriage. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Suddenly, the train lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on immediately. Darkness enveloped the compartment, thick and stifling, and the passengers let out small gasps of surprise. For a few moments, only the sound of the train's wheels grinding along the tracks filled the silence. Then, something else. A soft footfall, faint but distinct, from the corridor just beyond the dining car. Henry turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. It wasn't the conductor's heavy, shuffling gait. This was something lighter, more deliberate. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Across the aisle, the young woman from the honeymoon couple clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with fear. The old man with the satchel sat stiff as a board, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his seat. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back on, casting the train in a pale, sickly glow. And there, standing in the entrance to the dining car, was a figure, tall, gaunt, and draped in a ragged conductor's uniform. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, two hollow, empty sockets, stared out into the cabin with a lifeless gaze. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers, and Henry felt his blood turn to ice. The Phantom stood motionless, its figure shimmering faintly in the dim light, like smoke barely holding a human form. The temperature in the car plummeted, and Henry's breath came out in a misty puff. The ghostly figure moved forward, its steps slow and deliberate. It didn't walk so much as glide, its feet barely touching the floor. As it passed by each row of seats, the passengers recoiled, shrinking back in fear. But the Phantom seemed to take no notice of them. It moved as though it were searching for something, or someone. Henry's heart raced as the Phantom approached, and he found himself paralyzed, unable to look away. The air around him grew colder with each passing second, and the whispers returned, barely audible but unmistakable. They seemed to emanate from the figure itself, a chorus of distant, ghostly voices calling out in despair. The Phantom stopped just beside the honeymoon couple. The young woman whimpered, clutching her husband tightly, but the ghost ignored her. Its hollow eyes seemed to scan the passengers, lingering for a moment on each face, before continuing down the aisle. Henry forced himself to breathe, his body trembling. The ghost was heading toward him. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs refused to cooperate. The icy presence washed over him as the Phantom drew nearer. And for a moment, Henry thought it would pass him by, just as it had the others. But then it stopped. The Phantom stood directly in front of Henry, its hollow eyes locked onto his. The temperature plummeted further, and Henry could feel the cold sinking into his bones. He stared into the dark void where the figure's eyes should have been, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he felt the weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on him. It leaned closer, and Henry felt its icy breath on his skin. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm of distant voices. He heard faint words among them, but they were garbled, as if coming from a place far beyond the world of the living. Time is near. Just as Henry thought he couldn't take another second of the Phantom's gaze, it pulled back. The figure straightened, its hollow eyes still fixed on him for a moment longer. Then, without a sound, it turned and continued down the aisle, disappearing into the next car. Henry slumped back in his seat, his body trembling uncontrollably. The whispers faded once more, and the cold slowly began to recede. Around him, the passengers sat in stunned silence, their faces pale with fear. No one spoke, but they didn't have to. They all knew the same truth. The Phantom was searching for someone, and it wasn't finished. The train sped on, but the mood inside had shifted to something darker, more suffocating. The passengers were huddled in their seats, whispering to one another in fearful, broken sentences. Eyes darted nervously to the corridor where the Phantom had vanished, but no one dared move. The cold lingered, a constant reminder of the apparition that had passed through the car. Henry was still shaking, the icy presence of the ghost clinging to him like a damp fog. He stared at his hands, trying to steady them, but the terror of the phantom's hollow gaze wouldn't leave him. What had it wanted? Why had it stopped in front of him, only to move on? The silence was broken by a frail voice from the back of the carriage. "It returns every year," said the old woman who had been sitting alone. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying an eerie authority. The other passengers turned to her, drawn by the certainty in her words. She looked up, her eyes dark and hollow, as though she had seen too much in her lifetime. "What do you mean?" the young man from the honeymoon couple asked, his voice tight with fear. His wife sat trembling beside him, her face pale. The old woman gave a small, grim smile as though she had been waiting for someone to ask. "The phantom. It's not a story. It's not a legend meant to scare children. It's real. And tonight, we're all caught in its web." Henry leaned forward, his heart still racing, but now driven by a gnawing curiosity. "What is it? Why does it haunt this train?" The woman sighed, her gaze distant as she began her tale. "Many years ago, long before any of us were born, this train carried a conductor named Jacob Rayner. He was a strict man by all accounts, but fair. The kind of man who kept the train running on time, no matter what. But on one fateful Halloween night, something happened. There was an accident, though no one ever agreed on the exact cause. The train derailed just before it reached Ashgrove, plunging off the tracks into the ravine below. Nearly everyone on board perished. A chill settled over the passengers as they listened, the rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels the only sound cutting through the stillness. The old woman's voice grew softer, yet more intense. Jacob Rayner was one of the dead, but it said his spirit never found peace. Every Halloween he returns to this train, searching. He's cursed to wander these cars, looking for someone to take his place in the afterlife. Someone who will let him finally rest." The young woman from the honeymoon couple gasped, covering her mouth. "Take someone's place? You mean he chooses a victim?" The old woman nodded grimly. "Yes, each year, one passenger is taken. No one knows how he chooses, but once he finds them, they disappear. Gone without a trace. The train arrives at its final stop, but there's always one less person stepping off." A heavy silence fell over the car. Henry could feel the weight of the story pressing down on him, and the pieces began to fall into place. The whispers, the cold, the ghost's hollow eyes. It was searching for someone to take, just as the old woman had said. "So, it could be any of us?" the older man with the satchel asked, his voice trembling. The old woman's expression darkened. "Yes, and if the legends are true, it's already made its choice." The young man shook his head, disbelief written on his face. "This is insane. We can't just sit here and wait for some ghost to pick us off. There has to be something we can do." But the old woman only shook her head. "There's no escape once you're on this train. The phantom will find who it's looking for. All we can do is wait, and pray it isn't us." Henry's throat tightened. The phantom had stopped in front of him. Had it chosen him? The thought gnawed at his mind, threatening to unravel his sanity. He glanced out the window into the swirling fog, hoping for some sign of morning, some relief from the nightmare. But the night stretched on, as dark and endless as the legend itself. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak further. Each of them was now trapped in their own thoughts, wondering who among them had been marked for the phantom's return. The train's whistle pierced the night again, long and mournful, as if it, too, knew of the doom that awaited one of them before the journey's end. The train hurtled through the darkness, the relentless thrum of the wheels on the tracks like a pulse that grew louder in Henry's ears. The atmosphere in the carriage was thick with fear. The passengers, once strangers, now shared a deep, primal terror, each of them wondering who among them would be claimed by the phantom. Henry's mind raced as he replayed the old woman's tale. The phantom, cursed to wander the train, searching for someone to take its place in the afterlife. His stomach knotted as he remembered the way the ghost had paused in front of him, its hollow eyes seeming to pierce through him. Why had it stopped? Why him? The lights flickered again, and a gasp rippled through the car. The young woman clutched her husband's arm, trembling. The older man with the satchel shifted uneasily, glancing over his shoulder. They were all waiting for the phantom's return. Henry stood abruptly, drawing the attention of the other passengers. "We can't just sit here," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "If what she said is true, then one of us is in danger. We have to figure out how to stop it." The older man frowned. "And how exactly do you propose we do that? It's a ghost. You can't reason with something like that." Henry didn't have an answer, but the thought of doing nothing felt unbearable. His hands clenched into fists as he paced the narrow aisle. "Maybe there's something in the train," he suggested. "Something from the accident. Something that's keeping it here. If we can find it, maybe we can stop it." The old woman shook her head from her seat at the back. "The phantom isn't bound by an object. It's bound by the curse. Only when it takes someone will it leave. Until next year." But Henry wasn't listening. He couldn't accept that there was no way out. "I'm going to look," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. With a glance back at the others, he pushed through the door at the far end of the car and stepped into the corridor. The train swayed beneath his feet as he moved forward, the narrow passage eerily empty. His breath fogged the cold air, and the sense of something unseen watching him was unbearable. He moved past the dining car, his footsteps echoing in the tight space. The next car was dimly lit, the old lamps flickering weakly. It was a baggage car, filled with crates, suitcases, and forgotten items left behind from previous journeys. Henry's heart pounded as he pushed deeper into the shadows. The cold presence seemed to thicken around him, making the air harder to breathe. And then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He froze, his blood running cold. Slowly he turned, expecting to see the phantom's hollow eyes staring back at him. But the corridor was empty. Only the fog swirling outside the windows moved, pressing against the glass like pale fingers. His breath came quicker now, fear gnawing at his resolve. What was he doing? Chasing after a ghost? What if the old woman was right, and there was no escape, no way to stop it? He turned back toward the stacks of baggage, determined to search further. But before he could take another step, the door behind him slid open with a low, groaning creak. The phantom was there. It stood just inside the car, its skeletal frame barely held together by its tattered conductor's uniform. The ghost's hollow eyes locked onto Henry, and the cold that accompanied it was overwhelming. The whispers surged again, louder now, filling the space with their eerie, disembodied voices. Henry's pulse raced as he stumbled backward, the weight of the phantom's gaze pinning him in place. For a moment, neither of them moved. The phantom seemed to study him, its lifeless eyes taking in every detail. Then, as if making a decision, it took a step forward. "No," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible over the chorus of whispers. He turned and ran. His footsteps echoed down the corridor as he bolted through the baggage car, his heart hammering in his chest. The train seemed to tilt beneath him, the world spinning as he sprinted toward the next door. Behind him he could hear the phantom's footsteps, slow and deliberate, but relentless. He burst through the door into the next car, his mind racing. The other passengers, the others might be able to help. But as he stumbled back into the main carriage, he realized with growing horror that they weren't there. The seats were empty. He spun around, chest heaving, his breath ragged. Where is everyone? The train's lights flickered again, the walls closing in on him as the shadows grew deeper. Henry's mind was a whirlwind of panic. The passengers had vanished, and now it was just him and the phantom. The cold presence washed over him again, and Henry turned, knowing what he would see. The phantom stood at the far end of the carriage, its lifeless eyes fixed on him. This time, there would be no escape. It had found him. Henry's chest tightened as the phantom slowly advanced, its hollow eyes locked on him with a hunger that transcended the physical world. The air around him thickened with cold, and he could feel the pull of something dark and inescapable. The train shuddered beneath his feet as it raced through the night, but Henry knew that it wasn't headed to its intended destination anymore. This journey was bound for something far worse. With nowhere to run, Henry backed away, his hands gripping the cold metal of the seats for support. The phantom was drawing nearer, its ghostly form flickering like a dying flame, yet more solid, more real than before. The whispers rose again, louder, more desperate, as if the very walls of the train were pleading with him. Take his place. Take his place. Henry shook his head, panic welling up inside him. No! He shouted into the empty car. You can't have me! But the phantom didn't stop. Its skeletal hand reached out, and for the first time Henry could feel its icy touch. Not just the cold of the air, but the crushing weight of the grave itself, dragging him toward an eternity of darkness. The whispers intensified, filling his mind, drowning out any rational thought. Just as Henry felt the cold seeping into his bones, a voice broke through the chaos. A voice not from the whispers, but from the living. Stop! The old woman from the back of the train stood in the doorway, her frail figure framed by the flickering lights. She held a small, tarnished pocket watch in her trembling hands, holding it out toward the phantom as if it were some kind of ward. The ghost halted, its hollow eyes flickering with something like recognition. The whispers faltered, momentarily silenced by her words. This was yours, wasn't it? The woman said, her voice strong despite the fear in her eyes. She held the watch higher, the dim light reflecting off its cracked glass face. Jacob Rayner, the conductor. This was all you had left after the crash. Henry stood frozen, staring at the woman, trying to piece together what was happening. The phantom, the old woman's story, the watch. It all seemed impossible. Yet here it was, unfolding in front of him. The phantom's form wavered as it gazed at the pocket watch, the cold intensity of its presence dimming slightly. The old woman stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. You don't need another soul. Not anymore. You've already found what you lost. You can rest now. For a long moment, the phantom didn't move. It seemed to hover between worlds, its hollow eyes fixed on the watch, the whispers around it softening, as if something deep within the ghost was deciding whether or not to accept what had been offered. Then, slowly, its skeletal hand reached out. Its fingers, pale and translucent, brushed against the tarnished metal of the pocket watch. The moment they touched, a change rippled through the air. The oppressive cold began to lift, and the train seemed to shudder as if letting out a long-held breath. The phantom's form shimmered, its figure growing more and more transparent, dissolving into the dim light. The whispers faded to nothing, and for the first time there was a sense of peace in the carriage. As the ghost disappeared, the watch fell from the old woman's hand and clattered to the floor, its ticking stilled. Henry stared at the spot where the phantom had stood, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. It was gone. Somehow, impossibly, the nightmare had ended. The old woman turned to him, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes calm. It's over, she said softly, though her voice trembled. The curse is broken. The train jolted as if shaken from a dream, and suddenly Henry became aware of something he hadn't felt in what seemed like hours. The steady slowing of the train. Outside the windows, the thick fog began to lift, revealing the first light of dawn on the horizon. They were approaching the final stop. Henry exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The other passengers, who had been mysteriously absent, began to reappear, groggy and confused, as though they had woken from a deep sleep. The young couple blinked at each other, bewildered, while the older man with the satchel stretched, looking around as if unsure how they had all passed the night. The train rolled into the station at Ash Grove with a final drawn-out screech, its whistle blowing a long, haunting note. Henry stood, his legs weak, as the door slid open. The The platform outside was bathed in the golden light of the rising sun, and for the first time since boarding, he felt truly awake, alive. The old woman gathered her things and gave Henry a weary smile. "You were lucky, you know," she said quietly. "Not everyone makes it off this train." Henry nodded, still trying to process everything. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She paused, her smile fading slightly. "Just someone who's seen too many Halloweens pass on this train. But now, it's finally over."